To ensure safe operations, the Alaska Marine Highway System relies on sturdy vessels, sound seamanship, and perhaps most importantly, a crew that is alert, responsive, and aware. In this brief introductory video, we'll describe the working environment and its special challenges. We'll introduce the safety basics that can help reduce risk. We'll discuss the particular dangers posed by carbon monoxide on enclosed car decks. And we'll conclude with a program summary and some tips for working more safely and productively.
Hold it just a second. Double check that when you get up there.
It's an enclosed passenger ferry known as Ro-Ro, a roll-on, roll-off vessel. It's a practical and efficient way to transport people and vehicles over water. It's also a busy, challenging work environment, managing cars, trucks, and trailers of all sizes and their drivers.
A bit more, stop, or over your left forward.
You're going to have moving vehicles driving around. There's a lot of stuff going on. Sometimes the drivers are paying attention to something else or whatever, and if you're not paying attention, you might run into their way or whatever.
The car deck environment requires constant communication and situational awareness. Maintaining eye contact with drivers and with your fellow crew members ensures that you're seen and that instructions are acknowledged. Make sure you're working on a well-lighted deck so you can see your surroundings, and that you're aware of weather and sea states as you commence operations. The car deck has built-in safety hazards. Tie-down buttons and wrinkle bars help secure vehicles, but can trip you up if you're unaware. The binders, chains, and chocks used in the tie-down itself are tripping hazards. Any water, ice, or oil on deck can cause slips, trips, and falls. Some on and off ramps are steeper than others. Be aware of potential spillage from a vehicle bottoming out on a steep ramp. Know the location of spill response equipment on board, and caution drivers as they approach a steep ramp. Basic safety begins with the proper personal protective equipment, or PPE. All crew members must wear a reflective vest. Don't cover it up with a coat or rain gear. Dress appropriately for the weather. Wear safety shoes that are slip-resistant and steel-toed, and wear work gloves for your own protection.
It's important that crew members wear the reflective vest and be on the lookout for distracted drivers, and also be on the lookout for spilt oil, and ensure that drivers are following commands and understand you.
Back up a little bit.
Besides verbal and visual communication, radios are essential. Make sure they're charged, in good working order, and that you're tuned into the correct channels and frequencies.
Okay, can you get a hold of the engine room and tell them they need to take them down, please?
Announcements are made upon arrival from the purser's department to ensure that drivers are aware that they are not to start their engine until directed to do so by a crew member.
Okay, go ahead. You can start up. Watchman.
It's your job to make sure drivers hear, see, and obey instructions. Make sure their windows are down and their car radios turned off to facilitate clear communication. Watch out for pets who can get territorial and cause a distraction, and any drivers who may be impaired or intoxicated. Position yourself safely. When parking or directing a car, stand to the side to avoid being crushed or pinched between that vehicle and a bulkhead or other vehicle. Stay out of drivers' blind spots. Be especially aware of the protruding corners of vehicles. If necessary, have 2 crew members guide larger cars, trucks, or trailers.
If you do get a lot of exposure to it, and it can build up in your system for a while and kind of make you feel not real good, and of course, obviously in high concentrations, you can actually die from it.
A particular hazard on ro-ro vessels is a buildup of carbon monoxide, an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas that can be lethal. The most common symptoms of carbon monoxide exposure are headache, dizziness, drowsiness, weakness, upset stomach, chest pain, and general confusion. Larger exposures can create toxicity in the central nervous system and heart, leading to loss of consciousness and potential suffocation. Treatment of CO exposure consists of administering 100% oxygen and promptly moving the victim to a fresh, open area.
If all the drivers start their engines at once, this will cause levels to get fairly high, in excess of 200 parts per million.
2 important steps can prevent harmful carbon monoxide buildups. First, turn on all deck ventilation systems before loading or unloading, and open loading bay doors wherever possible. Second, don't let parked cars idle. Drivers must not start their engines until directed to do so.
We monitor carbon monoxide on the vehicle deck because it can be fatal and can cause serious health issues.
Wearable carbon monoxide monitoring devices can help detect the presence of the gas, sounding low-level and higher-level alarms. These devices sound a low-level alarm at 100 parts per million and display actual gas levels in real time. The devices will sound an upper-level alarm when concentrations reach 200 ppm. During ro-ro operations, there should be at least 2 crew members on deck wearing detection devices. When turned on, the devices can detect CO below hazardous levels, and no alarms will sound. A low-level alarm will notify the wearer that CO is present, but still below short-term exposure limits. Acceptable carbon monoxide limits are set by OSHA and the United States Coast Guard as 50 parts per million, averaged over an 8-hour period, with peak levels during ro-ro operations not to exceed 200 ppm. Keep in mind that the CO levels during loading and offloading can vary. The permissible exposure limits are weighted over a time period, such as 8 hours. Ro-ro operations typically take a relatively short period of time. If the level reaches 200 ppm, the crew member with the monitor may simply be too close to an engine exhaust and should immediately move away from the source. Always make sure monitors are tested and in good working condition. Here's a summary of CO effects. At 35 ppm, a concentration of 0.0035%, symptoms of exposure are headache and dizziness within 6 to 8 hours of constant exposure. At 100 ppm, symptoms include a slight headache developing in 2 to 3 hours. At 200 ppm, symptoms include a slight headache developing in 2 to 3 hours and some loss of judgment. At 400 ppm, victims develop a frontal headache within 1 to 2 hours. At 800 ppm of constant exposure, dizziness, nausea, and convulsions occur within 45 minutes. Victims can become insensible within 2 hours. At 1600 ppm of constant exposure, victims experience headache, increased heart rate, dizziness, and nausea within 20 minutes, and death in less than 2 hours. Drivers are often distracted and anxious to resume their journey. Make doubly sure you enforce procedures for starting their engines only at the appropriate time. Although it's unlikely crew members will experience extreme carbon monoxide concentrations, remember, carbon monoxide can be a killer.
So I like to designate at least one crew member as a rover who is responsible to walk around the car deck in order to ensure that any driver that does start their engine early will secure their engine.
Correct safety procedures can make Alaska Marine Highway System travel efficient and safe for both passengers and crew. Remember these key points. Always maintain eye contact and situational awareness with both drivers and fellow crew members. Be aware of tripping and slipping hazards, tie-down buttons, chains, ice or oil on deck. Wear personal protective equipment, especially a reflective vest, and dress appropriately for sea and weather conditions. Establish clear communication with radios, hand signals, eye contact, and verbal directions to drivers. Position yourself correctly to avoid blind spots and crushing or pinching hazards. Use 2 crew members as guides if necessary. Always ventilate the deck before loading or unloading, and enforce discipline on engine idling and startups. And finally, use carbon monoxide monitors and check them frequently. If you have questions or concerns about safety or procedures, don't hesitate to ask or share them. Working together, we can make travel on the Alaska Marine Highway System safe, efficient, and pleasurable.
Set your park brake.